Imagine this, you're watching a commercial with beautiful camera movement, cool lens flares, dynamic frames, but for some reason it feels empty. It looks great, but it doesn't mean anything. Because here's the truth, cool shots aren't enough. If they don't serve the story, they're just noise. In this video, I'm breaking down a recent spec commercial I was the cinematographer for, and showing you exactly how I use camera movement and specialty lenses to push the story forward and not just to show off. I'm gonna break down all the specialty shots in this piece, how they were designed, why they worked, and how you can adapt them to elevate your own commercials or branded projects. Because when you understand why a shot works, not just how to pull it off, you start creating visuals that feel intentional, and that is the main goal of any cinematographer. So this commercial was all about camera movement, and that's how the director wanted to tell the story. She really wanted to get involved in the narrative commercial side of things, and aligning with the director in exactly this style that they want is one of the most important things. So when we were making the shot list and converting her storyboard to that, we had to add a lot of movement into all the actions that we were doing. And when we look at this first shot, we're going to be looking at basically this in a continuation where we have this teddy bear on the floor and then it goes into this whip up. So when I talk about specialty lenses and I talk about probe shots and everything like that, a lot of people want to go through things, but that is obviously an excellent way to use the probe, and that's what they're designed for mainly. But a big thing that people don't realize is how it can get you different perspectives and getting you closer to objects, not necessarily on a macro level, but on a camera level in terms of just putting the lens on the floor. So let's kind of dive into exactly how we did that. And before we even get into that, let's talk about the cameras that I used for this commercial. So the classic combo that I like to use for everything, which was the Sony Venice, as well as the FX3. So that was just the combination that we used. And then generally all the probe shots that I like to do are always on the FX3 just because of this dual native ISO of 800 and 12,800. Let's reduce my brush stroke here. And then because natively probe lens, the ones that we're using were the Probe 2s by Laowa. That has a weird spelling, so I'm not just going to write it out. And they have a constant aperture lowest of T8. And that kind of runs into a lot of problems when you are using a base ISO of 800, because if we think about stops, you're usually shooting at a 1.8, 2.8. And then if we kind of go down the stops, you're going to go to a T4, which is 1, 5, 6, and then 2 and 8. So that's 3 stops of light that you're losing. And then if we talk about lights of power, that's going to be 3 times as much power of lights that you're going to need. So it gets really difficult when you are using a camera that doesn't really have a really good ISO. I remember we used to do a lot of probe shots on the Red Komodo, and it was an absolute nightmare, especially with the T14 lenses. So when they came with the T8s, it was amazing. So I always usually like to shoot this at the second base, depending on the scenario as well. So when we talk about this specific shot, this was actually on the Venice, and then it does have a base ISO of 500 as well as 2500 EI. And this is what I was using for this, and then with the Probe 2s. But in this case, I wasn't using the straight probe lens. So if we kind of really talk about how this is laid out, and you can guys see this in the BTS, I was just on a high hat. You could use a low hat, and then I have like the tripod head, which takes up a lot of weight and room as well. And then I have the camera. So you kind of have really one option here to get this specific shot. Because there's camera movement involved and we want to track the action to motivate what's happening, you need to be on a tripod head. So automatically I'm raising off the ground with a big O'Connor head like that, about probably 2 feet. And and the director specifically she wanted to be on the floor to feel that as well. So the way that you would do that is you would need a lens. These are usually known as, I think, stereoscopes or something like that. No. And to do this in traditional filmmaking, you would need something like a T-Rex lens, but we didn't have the budget to do that. And that's why I love the Probe 2s. So if we redraw this, our little camera, and then the Probe 2, the 90-degree attachment, We call it the elephant trunk because it's just funny and it looks like that. Allows me to get the perspective on the ground. It's not exactly perfect. You would have to use a low hat instead of a high hat to get it right down to the ground specifically, but we wanted to be tilting down at this a slight angle, because if I take away this and just use a normal probe lens, my camera angle would be like this, and we wouldn't have that perspective of being on the ground level. That's really important when you're trying to get these specific shots and everything like that, to use the proper gear. And like, to get something like that, you could just say, oh, I'll just put the camera on the floor and then tilt up. Yeah, that might work just for a second, but you're gonna still have that handheld shake and everything associated with that. So we wanted it smooth, and that's exactly how we did that. So now when we talk about how we lit this, if we kind of do a little top down of this room, this was kind of a really weird shaped room. It was almost like a hexagon, and then our talent is basically walking in here, and then they're landing on this spot, and the camera is pointed right here. So I had 3 lights in play here. I had the classic f22C, and this is all set to daylight. So this is set to 5600 Kelvin at 100%. And then outside, I have a 600C with a Fresnel. And then this is set to daylight as well, because in this point of the narrative that we are, it's daylight in the middle of the day. So that's why I just put everything to a daylight balance. And this is at 100%. And this is just creating that natural light that you see on the floor. So this is the sun. And because we were shooting in the early morning, the sun is coming down, and I really like to shoot at this time of day, especially for my daylight interiors, because it automatically gives me the highlights that you're looking for, natural sunlight on the floor. But the thing is that it doesn't come all the way over here, and that's what the light of the 600C Pro 2 here. Oh, sorry, I forgot to write in my thing. So if this is the f22C, and then I have a 600C out here, and then I also have a 600D just off to the side over here. 600D. And this is just shooting into the ceiling. And I'll talk about that in a second. And this was sitting at 50%. And then again, because it's a daylight balance source, it's going to be set to 5600 Kelvin. So again, this 600C is bringing that sunlight across into the room and giving me the highlights over here that we see on the ground. Because the sunlight is so high, it's only going to shoot into the bottom, and you can only see that. So I really wanted to bring that sunlight across. And then the f22C, I also have, I don't have a silk in front of that because I needed the power at that point, and it's giving me a harsh, like almost not necessarily like a soft look. It's more harsh here because usually with the f22C, it comes with like 2 layers of diffusion, but I don't really find that enough because I'm usually looking for something softer. But for daylight scenes, it's perfect because it gives you that natural light and that wrap to make it a little bit more softer. And then on the side here, let me just do this in blue. We just have a floppy to kill some of the spill and to add some neg back into the shadow side of our subject here. And we always like to shoot in the shadow of everything. So when I hide this still and then go to the next one, we can see that camera movement up, and then you can also see what that 600D is doing on the inside. So if we go back to our image here, I know this is a lot going on, and I basically had it shooting up into the ceiling, but not in that direction. It was more on this side to fill up and to give me more ambience, because even when you're looking at the brightest part of the day, which is usually in the middle of the day, and then you're deep inside of the room, not next to a window or anything like that, this area is bright, but because we're so far away from the window, we need to raise our ambience. And shooting a light or I like to use COB fixtures because they're point source, and I usually like to shoot that into the ceiling as it gives me more lift. The next shot that we're going to be looking here is another one, but now we're using the probe lens for its classic movement of basically going over something. And here, I want to talk about movement and how the director, Sofia, my partner, was like very much so like, hey, I want every shot to to feel intentional. She is searching for something, and then we want to basically pull back because she's walking into the room. So that already tells you like, hey, the camera can move at this point. Because if we just had a still frame of it just sitting here and then she walks into frame and then that's it, and it's not really necessarily working. That's why you have to have work with a director who knows exactly what she wants and what they want. And in this case, she did, because she wanted to have that movement. The classic thing would just have the dolly and then you would just see the edge of it, but we wanted to have that sweeping feeling where we're inside of a room and then we're going over something that just kind of breaks it and almost looks like that we're on a wall. So the way that we did this is, again, filmmaking is probably 90% of just cheating things in terms of just making everything look good. So let's do a top down. So this is our little whatever side table here. And then we have our room, which the talent is walking through. So she walks in like this and then lands there and then walks towards the keys, and she doesn't necessarily grab them because we do this in another shot. It's just to showcase the what it's like to have a kid who has a bunch of stuff. And then you can see that even the production designer Devin did an amazing job here of just having a bunch of drawings, crayons, and everything that looks like a kid was basically playing with her keys and just had it there, right? Again, this goes with amazing direction and just having all of that in play. And then here, this is actually the entranceway of the main house. Like the door is over here, just to give you guys some context. And then we're inside a laundry room, actually. My dolly tracks are sitting right here, and then my camera is here. I know this is a terrible drawing. But what, in this case, the probe lens allows us to do is basically, if this is my table, this is my camera, and the probe lens sticks out here, it gives you that perspective of like going over things. You wouldn't necessarily be able to do this with a traditional dolly setup with a traditional lens. You'd have to basically rig it overhead and do that. So we were moving fast, and these easy dolly setups were really good. So I'll just erase that. And in this case, this was later on in the day. And then a question you might say here is like, why we're using the FX3 for this shot? And this was at a base of 12,800. In this case, we're using the straight probe, and in the last shot used the Venice. And this was just because at the beginning of the day, I'm like, oh, we're just on the Venice in the shot, I'll just use it for this. And I didn't really have the foresight to think of like, oh, this would have been much better if I just used the Sony FX3. And this is just something that I adapted as I went on, and it just became easier. Because in the last scene, we had a lot of more high-powered lights. And in this scene, we didn't have a lot of high-powered lights at all. We were actually just using MCs, the natural daylight, and everything else in play. So if we really see what's going on here, we had this door open, and then I always love to add a little bit of texture onto things when it comes to recreating natural sunlight. And this is more of a evening look, so that's why our fixture is a little bit warmer. And then I had my favorite fixture out here, which is the Nanlite 60B with a projector mount on it. So this is the 60B. And then the gobo that I had on it was the tree branch one, so the one that looks like a bunch of trees, and then we just unfocused it. And then I have this set at 4,000 Kelvin, and this is around like probably 20%. At this point, when you're working a camera with such a high base ISO at 12,800, you don't need a lot of power for your lights. And the next thing that we wanted to do is just add a bunch of little sunlight and stuff onto the table itself here. So in addition to the 60B, we had the 600C with a spotlight. Sorry, that is a terrible 600C. And then it had a spotlight attachment there. And this is sitting at 5% and set to the same color temperature there. And this is giving me a nice backlight and an edge light on this little crayons is what we have going on here. So what we did is we just opened the door, and then we had those lights shining through, and that one was giving me a backlight and giving me this nice texture on here. And then the other one is giving me texture on the wall to really add to that as well. And then we just had a small little MC set to the same color temperature, and this was probably at 50% with a diffuser on it. And then this was just giving me a lot more levels, and it was just kind of like just sitting there to act as a key light. When we think about when the sun is setting to give us that glow and everything like that, we're thinking about there's a lot of contrast. There's a lot of orange, and there's a lot of dark and light spots. That's when usually what is associated with sunrise and sunset. So I have all this texture, this brick to play with, and that's why I like to paint lights on things as well as give hard cuts of shadow. And then we can even see that hard cut of shadow on these crayons and what's going on here. You always have to really align with your director before you even shoot or light a scene and be like, hey, what time of day is this? How do you want this to feel? And then she was like, glowy, afternoon, evening. She's about to head out to maybe potentially pick her up or something like that. And I'm like, perfect. That's all I need. And if that's it. And that's really all I need to really align with the scene. But then to even bring it into more realistic, if we think about this layers of what we have here, we have our foreground, we have our midground, and then we have our background, which gives us another potential to light something. And this is really only if you have time. And what we built for this was a really nimble lighting kit where I had a 600D, two 600Cs, a Nanlite 60B, F22C, and MCs. I know that you might seem like, oh, that's a big kit for this type of production, a narrative and everything like that. That is a very small lighting kit, and we used a very small team to pull this off because we were just working in one location and we had to make it feel different on multiple different times of day. So what I did here is on the side, just outside here, there's actually a pool, and then we have, another 600C. So if this was just the window here, and then we have that on a Fresnel. So these are both 600Cs. And then this is just shooting over here. And then, yes, you see that big highlight on her face here. And that is coming from our 600C. Because if you look in the background where the natural daylight is kind of following, you don't have that golden going across everything. You only have it necessarily coming in here. And I want to replicate it that's only necessarily coming from the door. If I had a bunch more time and a bunch more fixtures, I would paint a bunch of texture on the back wall too. But because this shot was so quick and I didn't have enough fixtures, I prioritized on the foreground, which was like the first room, and then I started working with the background with additional lights. So again, I have that 600C in the back, and you can literally see where it's painting that light, and it's putting it right down there. And then when we go to the next shot in the sequence, you can even see it on the couch and everything there. So really think about the lights that you have. And I know in a lot of situations you don't have a lot. And in this case, again, this was a small lighting kit for the production that I was doing. Just look at all those opportunities that you can always just add more texture. The next shot that we're going to is one of my favorite shots of the piece. And the reason why I like this shot so much is because this is the definition of what a commercial look looks like. And that is deep focus, wide lenses, and then that kind of very close focus to somebody's face. That's what is usually associated with a lot of the times when it comes to commercial looks. And then when we even talk about this, again, we're shooting on the FX3, 12,800. And, sorry, didn't need that extra zero. 12,800, and then again, if we remind ourselves these probe 2s and then we're using the straight probe at this point, is shooting at T8. And then I could have done this easily with a normal lens, but we were using the Arliss primes in combination with this. The close focus on that isn't as much as I can get with a probe lens, and that's why I really like that. But then Zachary, you can just say like, oh, you could have just used a diopter, and not necessarily in this case, because the diopter only really brings your closest focus closer, but it brings your far focus closer as well. It kind of shifts it forward. So I wouldn't necessarily, in this shot, because we're pulling out, I wouldn't necessarily have that focus at the end of it. And then the director was really happy with the look as well, because like everything is in focus, everything is sharp. And this is, again, associated with the commercial look when we talk about contrast ratios. So when we talk about here, we have our classic Rembrandt lighting that we always look for. And then we have our light side, which is very pleasing with a nice contrast ratio to our shadow side. So again, I really worked with my gaffer to set the scenes of this to make it as easy as possible to establish a light and dark side. And that was really easy to do because we had amazing location that had windows that wrapped around the entire inside of the house. So it really made everything easy to light everything, because we could just put all our lights inside, and then I could just have my F22C key light inside. And then what that does is, because these are all windows over here, it gives me a massive catch light in her eyes, and that's what it makes this shot look so good. And then when we talk about what's going on here on the inside, so we have our subject, and then we have our dolly track with our camera on top of that, and then the dolly is pulling out, and then I just have the classic F22C here, and then I have a 4x4 artificial silk in front of that. So I like to use Art Silk for like all my diffusion, just because it's just one of the most available and what a lot of the new age filmmakers are using. You can use unbleached muslin, that takes up a lot. You can use magic cloth, but like artificial silk is like kind of the in-between for just commercial stuff. And I just like to use it for a lot of things. And then you can get this in frames and you can hang this if you want, but usually I just always rent a 4x4 flag that is artificial silk, and then I just put the F22 in front of that. So a lot of people get the so this is the F22C, and a lot of people get confused about diffusion. If I just put a lot more diffusion in front of my F22C inside the box, it's going to give me a softer source. No, it's just going to cut down your light, and it doesn't give you something softer. You want it to spread it to make it bigger, and that's why I use something like a 4x4 or a 6x to really spread out my light to give it something softer, but you still want to cut it at the same time. So this was set to 5600 Kelvin because we're still in that daylight section of the commercial that we're looking for, and this is set at 50%. Don't need a much here, I just needed to add a little bit on the face. And then on the left side, because we established that all our light is coming from here, I'm gonna add some negative fill back in, and then you can see that on here, and it's not that much. And I would have to review the BTS because I don't think we had any negative fill on the left side, but because I shot this so long ago, but my natural instinct is to have a 4x4 solid here. So, and then that's the easiest thing, is to just do that in a floppy, just to add some back into it, but I don't exactly remember, but I think I did that. And yeah, that's basically the shot. And then on the outside, we had our classic 600Cs. We had two of them with a Fresnel and spotlight, and they weren't really in play into this shot because we weren't necessarily looking for any harsh highlights or anything. This was just mid of the day, and the director and I kind of bounced back and forth what we were looking for the scene. But again, big commercial looks are usually associated with shooting at a T2.8 to a T4, and that's what I've been doing in a lot of my work because it's easy. Once you get a lens, again, example, we were using the Arliss primes that shoot at T1.3. I only used that T-stop for one specific shot later on in the commercial because it was like more of a panic sequence to basically really heighten the emotions of things. You don't necessarily want to think yourself as a technical operator when it comes to these shots. You want to be intentional, and that is the main thing, and you have to use those tools to be intentional. As we move on to our last shots, there was just so many shots in this piece that were like, I could just say one of my favorites is just because of the production design, the direction, the styling, the lighting that we had, and even the final shots with the color and everything. I just had a lot of room to play because the director allowed me to do that. You have to have a really good relationship, in this case, obviously the relationship with my partner, in terms of what she likes and what I like. And our styles very much like cohesively blend together, and that's why we work so well together, because she loves the commercial looks, she loves sunlight hitting things, she loves her production design and adding colors. And that's the biggest thing that will make your commercials look good production design, and able to communicate that as well. As we can see that we have some vintage toys that add a lot of blues into the scene, this ball that adds a lot of greens and yellows, and then a little hint is like there's this swimming medal that has a half eaten lollipop stuck to it, and then we have this another robot with blue, and then we have all these kinetic toys in the background that just gives so much color. And then when you look at her specifically, she has a yellow and green, which are good complementing colors. Not exactly, it'd be kind of like green and red, but that's too Christmassy and we didn't want to hit that. So it's just a really good direction on this point. And it just allows me to do my job a lot easier because I just have to put my lights in the right places to make things pop. And that's what I'm looking to do. And then you can look at this and be like, Zachary, we're on light side here. And it really doesn't matter when you talk about what makes a image interesting, and that is contrast. So when we start looking at the dark parts of this image, we have this hard cut of this sofa that we're under. So great, this is dark. And then we have this streak of shadow that's created by the sofa as well. So this is dark as well going into this corner. Automatically, I'm drawn as a viewer to the center of the frame, and this gives me an idea to start playing with things. So obviously in an ideal world, I would love to have the sunlight on this side coming through here and giving me that look that we're going for. But I also have to think about continuity and when we're shooting this, because this is a narrative commercial and continuity is so important, because she looks under here and then we swap sides and then we're on the shadow side. So in this case, you have to do some compromises when it comes to this, because if I do a top down of this situation right here, just kind of doing it in the corner here. So we had our windows here that we were lighting from specifically. So this was established in the last shot as well. And then we have our couch here that we're going under, and then camera is pointing through this way, and then the camera is, I believe it was pushing in at this point, and then we're going under with the probe lens. And then, so I'm lighting from this point, and then all my negative and contrast is going to be on this side, and my light is going to be on that side. And that's just something you have to consider when you talk about the shots and when we look at the location and everything just associated with that. It's okay to jump onto the light side. You just don't want to break that 180 degree. So we had that 600C with a Fresnel, and that is just sitting outside. And at this point, we have this around like 4,400 Kelvin. This is sitting at 4,400 Kelvin, and this is sitting at 100%, because again, 600C isn't that much of a powerful light, but it gives me enough to add some more highlights. And then because I'm shooting again this on the FX3 with a base ISO of 12,800, this is great. So usually in a lot of these shots, I like to have my sun high just to create these shadows, but I put the light a little bit lower, and this was just me talking to my gaffer, because I wanted to create long shadows that we're kind of later in the day, because if I had the high ones, yet you can see that the direction of the sun is kind of like this with the shadows that are coming down. So this is something that are tiny details that you need to play with, because in the next sequence of the shots, we have the 600C acting as the sun, and then we have that higher up and on the stand. So these are just things to really consider. And then when we talk about the camera setup to actually achieve this, we used a T-bar and a mess of Apple boxes and so many other things just to prop up the couch. So because we were so low to the ground, and that an inverted T-bar setup puts the camera as low as possible, because that's what I wanted as the perspective, and then we had to kind of shoot through this. There's so many things that we had to figure out. So we used like the slider stands to do that, and then in the back, I don't know what we used to prop this up exactly, but again, we had those stands there, and then we had to use a mess of Apple boxes and sandbags just to prop up this on its two corners, and then also here. And then we were just avoiding so many things, and the shot window was so small, because at that point we didn't really have a lot of movement, but that was enough movement to get the director's point of view across of like, hey, yes, we could do a static here, but I want movement on everything. And that's something that she really challenged me, especially with this. And I feel like that's where my best work comes out, when I have a director, especially my partner, challenge me in terms of just like, hey, we want this shot, but make it better. You know what I mean? And that's what usually movement does a lot in these situations. So I hope breaking down a lot of these probe shots and seeing the BTS as well alongside of the cinematic breakdown really helps you think when you're trying to use these lenses and use different things to get different perspectives of scenes. And when it comes to camera movement, and especially with narrative commercials, try to be intentional as possible, because that will really bring your images for something that feels good to that 80% to 90 to even 100%, so that you're happy with it, you're content with the work, and it really sells the point across and makes the viewer feel something.